Good evening, and welcome to everyone. Thank you all for coming out on a cool, I was going to say spring, but fall night. It could be any one of the seasons, as we know. But it's wonderful to see faces again. As you know, we're still slowly emerging from the last couple of years and readjusting and reacclimating ourselves to being with each other and being in a space together and enjoying each other's company. So we're happy that you chose to be with us tonight. I want to welcome you on behalf of the board of the Stone Center and the Stone Center staff to this, which is our 30th Sonja Haynes Stone Memorial Lecture. It's a fairly interesting one for me because this will be the last Stone lecture that I participate in as director of the Stone Center. As you know, we have a new director coming in the spring, an exciting new scholar who's already dived headfirst into all of the work and the activities that the Stone Center engages in, and we're all very, very excited about her being here. Her name is Dr. LaRonda Manigault Bryant. As some of you know, a renowned scholar who teaches religion and philosophy, is also a documentary filmmaker, a very, very well-versed individual when it comes to African-American culture, rituals, ceremonies, etc. So she'll be right at home with us here. So this 30th Stone Lecture, and actually my 22nd, is going to be very interesting for me. And I'm glad that you all are here to share that moment. I want to mention a couple of things about what this lecture means, and we're going to have a couple of my colleagues that will be speaking and say a little bit more about that specifically. But for me, it's kind of a momentous thing. When I first came, I wanted to make a bold statement, and the way I made that bold statement was trying to invite, now I'm forgetting her name, that shows you how important it was, but inviting this very famous actor to speak. And people were saying, you'd never get her, she'd never get here. What is her name? No, not Ruby Dee. I wish it was her. Alfre Woodard. Thank you. See, other people's memory. This is one of the reasons I got to go, because the memory, you know, is beginning to fade. But as my grandkids say, that's just because you have more things to remember than most people. But Alfre Woodard came, and it was right after 9/11, and she did a remarkable. We actually moved to. We moved to a larger auditorium and a larger space, to Memorial Hall, and just a remarkable reflection on what it takes to bring people together, how dangerous and scary things get before people understand that there are some common interests that we have. She's a wonderfully gracious person, and we were, of course, very embarrassed that all of the restaurants were closed when she finished. So we had to give her a tuna fish sandwich, and she was so happy with that sandwich. A very down-to-earth person. But again, those are the memories that come to mind, and we've had some great presentations over the years, and I'm very, very happy that this remains one of those kinds of programs that 9 times out of 10, if not 100% of the time, brings the kind of people that we need at that particular moment. And I think this is what's happening tonight, that we're very fortunate. I was fortunate enough to have lunch with Ms. Lanier and her daughter, Shani, and as you might suspect, we talked about everything. It had a lot to do with what the subject is tonight, but also some of the other kinds of things happening around the country that relate to what we're going to focus on. So I'm not going to sit up here and reminisce. This is one of the things that can turn an interesting program into a long slog. I just want to let you know that we're going to follow the order of the program, so I will not come back up and forth. We're going to begin with Selena Bray, who is our Sean Douglas Leadership Fellow for this year, who will talk a little bit about Dr. Stone and offer a tribute. We'll then go to Taylor Corpening, who will do a presentation on behalf of Theta Pi chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha. Alexandra Odom, one of our graduate students who works in Stone Center Library, actually is kind of the co-director of the Stone Center Library, who will give a history of the Stone lecture. And then our good friend and colleague, James Williams, who will introduce the speaker for the evening. I also want to remind you that immediately after Ms. Lanier's presentation, we will have time for questions. I'm sure you'll have plenty. So, Selena, if you want to come up.
Good evening. My name is Selena Bray Bowles. I'm a native of Tuskegee, Alabama, a senior here at UNC studying public policy and American studies, and a Sean Douglas Leadership Fellow through the Sonja Haynes Stone Center from fall 2022 to the spring of 2023. Today, I have the honor of reflecting on Dr. Stone's legacy and her commitment to creating a more just environment at UNC and beyond. This annual lecture, in Dr. Stone's honor, spotlights women of African descent who have made and are currently making significant contributions in social justice, art, service, and education. Dr. Sonja Haynes Stone exemplified what it meant to be a woman so rooted in this sort of change-making, and she was also grounded to each of her communities. In every avenue of her life, she did the work. In earning her bachelor's degree in social science from Sarah Lawrence College, master's degrees in social work as well as social and ethical philosophy from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and her PhD in history and philosophy from Northwestern University, Dr. Stone demonstrated her dedication to an intellectual and comprehensive understanding of social issues and structures. She combined her academic and structural sensibilities with a praxis rooted in care, dignity, and perseverance. She was hired in 1974 at UNC as an assistant professor, and over the course of 17 years, she held various positions. She served as director of Afro-American Studies curriculum, worked tirelessly on the planning committee for the Black Cultural Center, was a part of the campus-wide advisory board, acted as an advisor for the Black student movement, and was involved in so much more. Every facet of Dr. Stone's work at UNC was underpinned by a deep compassion and regard for students. She was intensely engaged with student life on UNC's campus and always made it a priority to connect with students, whether they were in her classes or not. By melding her reverence for Black arts and creativity with her passion for empowering and amplifying Black voices, Dr. Stone asserted that societal progress must include cultural, communicative, and expressive strides. She received several recognitions, including the 1983 Black Student Movement Faculty Award, the 1978 National Council of Black Students Dedicated Service Award, and she was also named the National NAACP's Woman of the Year in 1981. Now, in 2022, Dr. Sonja Haynes Stone's works continue to inspire students, including me. Her conceptualization of activism as a reflective and introspective practice prompts me to consider the ways in which my personal values, honesty, equity, and kindness, just to name a few, can be harnessed to advance causes from voting rights in Alabama's Black Belt to combating environmental racism in historically Black Eastern North Carolina communities like Princeville. Her emphasis on engagement with social justice advocacy both on and off campus pushes me to consider the local, national, and global implications of social ills like migrant detention, systemic sexism, vast disparities in healthcare, and state violence. It's the same emphasis that has encouraged me to get involved with the Poor People's Campaign as a community volunteer, and with the Orange County Literacy Center as an educator for immigrants preparing for the United States naturalization exam. Dr. Stone didn't rely on vapid buzzwords to drum up enthusiasm. She made meaningful connections with folks, and rather than treating them like pawns in a game of social entrepreneurship, she interacted with them as people with complex lives and hardships. I work to internalize her example in all components of my leadership on campus. As editor-in-chief of Black Ink magazine, I try to provide every staff member with the tools they need to tell their revolutionary story. As a Sean Douglas Leadership Fellow, I work to serve as an effective bridge between the Stone Center and student organizations to facilitate dynamic programs and opportunities. I do not partake in this work because I have a penchant for being busy or for Zoom meetings. I do so because I, like many other members of the Carolina community, am encouraged, invigorated, and inspired by Dr. Stone's cultivation of a social justice approach that's thoughtful, ethical, and necessarily transgressive. While she may not have had an empirical list of solutions, she sought to disrupt flawed systems and challenge ingrained behaviors in truly radical ways. Though she's no longer with us as she passed away in 1991, Dr. Stone's accomplishments, memory, and honor transcend time. I have many questions that I wish I could have asked her, and while I'll always be curious about her answers, I am certain that she would have told me, my peers, and all of you to keep fighting for what's right. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Corpening, and I'm the president of the Theta Pi chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And as Selena just so beautifully said, you have such a way with words, Dr. Stone was an integral part of our community here at Carolina, and she advocated for social justice and just propelling Black people to be the best advocates and the best people we can be. And the Theta Pi chapter would like to thank you for making this presentation today. And Ms. Lanier, if you would come join me. We have a token of our appreciation for all the work you do. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra Odom, and as was mentioned before, I'm currently the graduate assistant in the Stone Center Library. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us today for the 30th annual Sonja Haynes Stone Memorial Lecture. For the past 30 years, the Stone Lecture has been a signature program here at the Sonja Haynes Stone Center for Black Culture and History. It is one of the longest-running programs here at the Stone Center, as well as one of the longest-running lecture series at the university that focuses specifically on African Americans and African American culture. Every year, we look forward to the opportunity of honoring the memory of Dr. Stone by inviting speakers who embody what she stood for, not only in her professional work, but also in her work in service to the UNC community. The focus of the lecture has always been on African American women and women of African descent. Every speaker who has been gracious enough to partake in this annual event has stood at the nexus of activism, art, culture, and social justice. In 1995, we had the opportunity to welcome Bell Hooks to campus. In 1997, Angela Davis's lecture focused on the rise of the prison industrial complex in America. In 2002, as Dr. Jordan mentioned earlier, Alfred Woodard's powerful presentation in the wake of 9/11 focused on how, in the midst of unimaginable tragedy, people who have never been willing to talk to one another were being able to be brought together within our country. In 2012, Beverly Guy Sheftall reminded us of the power Black women have when we use our voices to fight for equality. And in 2018, jazz musician Naila Fallon's Dynamics talk spoke to the power of our ancestors, the essence of love, and the precious fleeting nature of our time here on earth. And in 2004, Dr. Stone's daughter, Ms. Precious Stone, reminded us of the ways that Dr. Stone's legacy has continued here at the university and how we can continue to learn from her well into the future. Today, we are thrilled to be continuing this legacy as we hear from Ms. Lanier, who Mr. James Williams will be who will be introducing in just a moment. Ms. Lanier is yet another wonderful addition to the series of lecturers that pays homage to and continues Dr. Stone's work here on this campus. I had the wonderful opportunity to join Ms. Lanier and her daughter today for lunch, and if her talk is even half as interesting as our conversation was at lunch, I'm sure that you all are going to join it immensely, so I'm definitely looking forward to that. We are overjoyed that you were able to join us today, and thank you all for coming. Ms. Lanier's fight to reclaim the identity and dignity of her ancestors could not be more aligned with the mission of the center and the history of this lecture series, and we thank you all for coming.
Good evening. I am James Williams, and it is indeed a pleasure and I think a privilege to be able to introduce Tamara Lanier. She did authorize me to say Tammy, and I may use that, this evening for the Stone Lecture. As indicated in the program, one of the things that I do, I chair the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition. And one of the things that we do is focus on the educating and engaging the public on the legacy and the history of racial terror lynching and its impact on our society today, that legacy, that shadow. And when I think about what Ms. Lanier has done, it is also saying we must address and reckon with and hold accountable those who inflicted this harm, and she is embarking upon that effort. So just looking at her background, she is a tireless champion for truth and justice, and her advocacy has taken her in many parts of the state, the country, and even the world. She's a 27-year veteran of the state of Connecticut Judicial Branch, retiring in 2017 as Chief Probation Officer 2 in the Norwich Probation Office. Another thing that we have in common, I retired after 27 years as public defender here in Orange and Chatham County. So we were I was meant to do this, okay? She has a long and distinguished record of public service and social advocacy with past affiliations with organizations such as the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, a commissioner for the City of Norwich Ethics Commission, the U.S. Attorney's Working Group to monitor federal and state civil rights compliance with educational institutions, and a member of the Commissioner of Education's Roundtable for Family and Community Engagement. Recently, she was appointed by the governor to the state's first Hate Crime Advisory Council. In May of 2015, Ms. Lanier was named Woman of the Year by the Connecticut General Assembly's Commission on African American Affairs. In November of 2016, she received the Connecticut Commission of Human Rights and Opportunities Leaders and Legends Award and the 2019 Inspirational Women's Award. She's an active member and engaged with the ACLU of Connecticut, the Connecticut Racial Profiling Prohibition Board, the vice president of the New London NAACP, and the St. Joseph's Christian Church of Groton, Connecticut. She is busy, busy, busy. And she has a number of passions, one of which is to eradicate racial and ethnic disparities in Connecticut's criminal justice system and to put an end to racial profiling. She has been a constant voice for change, traveling across the country, promoting the need for a dialogue relative to slavery and its impact on society. She has even had conversations with folks like John Lewis, Congressman John Conyers, and former Dean of the House of Representatives to discuss the potential for federal legislation mandating the protection of cultural relics of slavery. And she has filed this lawsuit. And let's think about this, the courage and the vision that it would take to sue one of the most powerful institutions in this country. And she has done that, and that litigation is ongoing and trying to force the nation and Harvard to reckon with its history of slavery and its exploitation even afterwards of that institution. So, and she's got by her side what we affectionately call the Black People's Attorney General, Mr. Ben Crump. So at any rate, it is indeed a pleasure, and let's give a warm welcome to Ms. Lanier.
Wow, thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you all. I will start by just introducing myself again. My name is Tamara Lanier, and I am the plaintiff in the Lanier v. Harvard reparations lawsuit. I will introduce my daughter who's sitting here, my daughter Chanrel Lanier. And one of the things that I've been telling my children, I have 2 daughters, and I want to engage them in this campaign and have them as active as I am, because there's a thing about passing the torch. And when I get to the point where I can't stand and speak about this anymore, I want my children to be able to step up and carry on. And that's really what this story is about. It's about generational oral history and passing the torch and keeping our oral history and our family stories, sharing them with our children and encouraging them to hold on to those stories, because that is who we are. I want to say to Dr. Jordan, I did not know he was leaving and this was his last semester. I just met with him and fell in love with him, and now he's leaving. And so I want to say, I'm sure that you will be missed. I want to thank you for this opportunity to share this beautiful space. I took a brief walk around, and I marvel at the opportunities that young people have today. When I was coming along, we didn't have this, and we didn't have these opportunities. So appreciate what you have and take full advantage of it. But you are eternally blessed to have not only Dr. Jordan, but an amazing academic institution that values what we're here to talk about tonight and gives you the platform to do it. So I want to say thank you. And I want to point to the quote that's at the bottom of the screen that says, there's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. And the reason why I placed that there, because I needed to say and share that there is a divine providence over not only my life, but this story. And I can sit here or stand here and tell you about incidents throughout this 12, 13-year journey where I believe that God put people in my path, put information at my footsteps, and opened doors for me that are no other means explainable. The miraculous things that happened, that I was exposed to, and it's just a divine intervention for the reason that I believe that this is a purpose-driven story with a specific story, and I believe that the specific purpose is about healing and reconciliation. And so this story, which I'm talking to you about tonight in 2022, is a story that my family and my ancestors were talking about in the 1820s. And it has been passed down from generation to generation to generation. And the other thing that's so uniquely amazing about this story, when I do the research now and I look back at the documents that my mother and my ancestors never saw, it's almost as if they were reading from these documents, but they never saw them. That's how accurate our oral history is. So if you take one thing away from this discussion tonight, if you have a grandmother or an elder in the home who knows your family history, sit down and talk with them. Learn as much as you can about who you are. And I say that because we are the keepers of our family stories and our oral history. What was written about us wasn't intended to tell the truth or to glorify us. How we know who we are is because of the oral history and the narratives that our families have passed down from generation to generation. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to have my daughter read a little overview of the case to kind of put things in context as to where we're starting from.
History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but faced with courage, need not be lived again. The plaintiff, Tamara Lanier, brings this action against Harvard for its wrongful seizure, possession, and exportation of photographic images of the patriarch of our family, a man known as Renty, and his daughter Delia. The images, known as daguerreotypes, were commissioned in 1850 by Harvard's leading scientist Louis Agassiz as a part of the quest to prove Black people's inherent biological inferiority and thereby justify their subjugation, exploitation, and segregation. Responsibility for the crime lies squarely with Harvard, having promoted and legitimize this poisonous myth of white superiority. Historical amnesia, particularly where racism is concerned, is an American tradition, but Harvard's transgressions run much deeper. In 1976, Harvard discovered the daguerreotypes were stored on its campus, realized their incalculable value as the earliest known photographs of African slaves, and commenced a decades-long campaign to sanitize the history of the images and exploit them for prestige and profit. But Renty and Delia remained enslaved and are still enslaved in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Their images, like their bodies before, remain subject to the control and appropriation of the powerful, and their familiar identities are denied to them.
Thank you. So that is actually taken from our complaint, and if you have an opportunity, it is online. In many universities, I know that Villanova is teaching it, Yale is teaching it, Brown University is teaching the complaint, as well as I think New York University. Several universities that I've visited is actually teaching the complaint as a part of their African American Studies campaign. But at any rate, if you have a chance, go online and read the complaint. It's a truth-telling opportunity and a truth-telling history lesson, things that you've never heard before and would be surprised. Next slide. So I included this slide of Sankofa because this is what Renty's story embodies for me. And the term Sankofa, in the language of Ghana, the term symbolizes the word retrieve. It symbolizes a prophetic message from the past that cries out to the present to never forget where you come from. But for me, it's much more than that. It's much more powerful for me as it relates to my enslaved ancestors and the slave daguerreotypes. I can't move forward until I go back and recover what I feel is rightfully mine, and that is the return of my enslaved ancestors' cultural property. So this is my mom. Her name is Maddie Pearl Thompson Lanier. She was born in a small community called Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama. She was born the daughter of sharecropper parents. She was a retired teacher, she was a principal, and she was also someone who was raised in a household with her grandfather, who was born a slave, who lived many years as a slave, and his name was also Renty Taylor Thompson. And my mother would sit and listen intently to who she called Papa, talking about life as a slave, talking about his grandfather, who was Papa Renty, the man in the image. And so my mother was hearing firsthand from a man born and lived, who was born and lived as a slave, these stories about this phenomenal African-born man named Renty. His Papa Renty. And my mother internalized those stories. And as a child, as far back as I can remember, these are the first stories I'm hearing about the Black African, the proud African, the man who learned to read, who taught others to read. He got a hold of Noah Webster's book, The Blueback Speller, and taught himself to read, and would teach anybody to read at a time when it was illegal to do. And he was actually putting his own life on the line to teach people to read. And so this is who Papa Renty was. He was an educator. He was literate, and he was a man of faith. My mom tells stories about him teaching from the Bible and hosting Bible lessons and singing, gospel songs and religious songs. And so this man who had this amazing, rich history and this legacy is the same man that Harvard in 1850, and now we have to again go back to context. Think about what's happening in our country in 1850. The country is divided over the question of race, kind of like where we are today, unfortunately, but divided over the question of slavery and emancipation. And now you have the most powerful academic institution in the world stepping forward to say, Black people are subhuman. Black people are inferior. Black people don't deserve the benefit of the Constitution because they're not human. They are a subspecies, not of the same blood as us. And this is the science and the scientific racism that Harvard is promoting at this time, when you already have the country divided over race. Now you have a premier academic institution saying they're not human. They don't deserve the same protection. Not only did they travel from Boston to Columbia, South Carolina to inspect my enslaved ancestors, but they also took pictures, measured body parts to say, look at these stark differences. That's not human. That does not deserve the same protections as we do. And you had people who were purportedly abolitionists believing this. You had people who were abolitionist politicians, like Daniel Webster, who was the senator, U.S. senator in the state of Massachusetts at the time. He traveled south to the same slave plantation, Benjamin Franklin Taylor's plantation, and when he went back north again, he said, I'll never speak against slavery again. But there was one motive that no one was talking about at the time, and that was the financial motive. And what my complaint talks about and what my attorneys write about is the fact that cotton was the thread that held the Union together. Cotton was making slaveholders in the South exponentially wealthy, and the Industrial Revolution in the North was making the people in Boston and Connecticut and New York just as wealthy or even more wealthier than the people in the South. Next slide, please. So my mother, with all of these stories about who this great man, Paparenti, was, she had, on her maternal side, traced her ancestry. Her cousin actually had, and he created this book, From These Roots. And on my mother's maternal side, we had the Williams, the Murdochs, and the Lightfoot. And so my mother's cousin traced on her maternal side back to a woman they called Big Mammy, who was born in Africa. And her cousin did the work and put together a genealogical tree from Big Mammy to my mom's generation. So my mom's goal was to do the same thing, tracing on her paternal side her roots back to Africa, because she knew Paparenti was the Black African. And so she wanted to start with Paparenti and put together a family tree. Most of my childhood, she talked about, I want to do this book, I want to do this family. Now keep in mind, and I know a lot of you, I'm aging myself, but around when my mom was talking about this, 2010 and earlier, we didn't have access to information like we do today. We couldn't just pick up the phone and Google. We actually had to go to archives and do the research and go through the dusty files and find these documents that now you can pick up your phone and find within moments. So it was difficult back then, and it was something she wanted to do but never got around to doing. Next slide. So the one thing that she would say to us was, I want you to write these things down. She would tell us these stories, write it down. I want you to write these things down. My daughter Shanrell, when she was in 5th grade, my mom and she sat down and wrote a little makeshift family tree book, and my daughter entitled it From These Roots I Came. And she also, her dedication page was to my youngest daughter, and she wrote that it was dedicated to her little sister, so she'll always know where she came from. And those were my mom's words. It was important to her that we know whose we were and where we came from. And so my mom, towards the end of her life, of course she's talked about this for most of her life and most of my life, all of my life. She's now stricken with a number of serious illnesses, and she knew she was facing her own mortality. And it became more and more important to her, write these things down, write these things down. When I would visit her in the nursing home, she'd want to talk about these stories, write these things down. When she was in critical care, you know, when she could talk, she was like, I want you to write these things down. And on one occasion, I was coming in from work, and I had my dictaphone in the car. My mom was naming these names, and some of them were complicated and strange names, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to record this because I'm not even sure how to spell this, so I'm just going to record you talking. And so I started recording her. And thank God I had the presence of mind to do that, because now when people say, well, it really wasn't like that, I said, look, I got the recording, I can play it for you. That's one of the things that Harvard initially challenged me on. She can never prove it. But like I said, God had spoken favor over my life, and I had my receipts. I was able to go up in my attic and pull out my daughter's book where she's writing about paparinti. I had a tape recorder where we were talking about paparinti before the daguerreotypes were discovered. And we could prove it because we had these ancient documents. And so when my mom passed, and mind you, at this point, I didn't know anything about the daguerreotypes. And so when my mom passed, I had such guilt because one of the things we were doing, she loved to talk about this story, so that when my kids would go in and visit her when she was feeling poorly, they would say, Grandma, tell us that story about paparinti. And just this perfect peace would come over her, and it relaxed her. And she enjoyed telling this story so much. And the one thing she would always say is, write it down. I want you to put this in a book. I want you to make the little family tree. And we're okay, Ma, yeah, we're gonna do it. And, never really thinking seriously about doing it, but just trying to comfort her in that moment. And so when she passed, I had such remorse and guilt about making those promises. And I knew I had to follow through, but I didn't know what to do. And I talk again about God's favor. I'm out walking one day for lunch, and I passed by this small ice cream shop that was owned by this gentleman here. And I mean, he was a frail old senior citizen and his wife. They owned this ice cream shop. But they had great food. And I would stop in and I would just make small talk with this gentleman. So I came back from my walk and I was stopping in to get my lunch, and I said, did I tell you my mom passed? And he says, I'm sorry, and we're talking. And I told him about this promise that I had made to my mother. And this is in 2010, and he says, well, write down what you know, and I'll do the research. And so I remember looking at him thinking, because at this time, seniors didn't even know how to turn a computer on, let alone navigate on the app. I'm not, me either, I wasn't much better. But I'm looking at him like, okay, all right. But I said, just play along. I wrote down, about paparinti. He was known as the Black African, and some of the names that my mom had given me. And I left the shop. And I didn't go back right away. And I really didn't believe that he was going to be able to do the genealogical research and find anything. And so a couple of weeks go by, and I go in the shop, and I walked in, and I remember him holding his arm. Where have you been? I found your paparinti on the internet. And I remember like, yeah, right. Like, what is my paparinti doing on the internet? And so I still had no confidence in him. But again, I'm talking about, the favor of my life. We exchanged, I didn't even know his name. We just talked. We exchanged names and email addresses, and he sent me an attachment. And I go home, and the first thing I open is this ugly story about Louis Agassiz and who he was, and this scientific racism and how they used these enslaved people for experiments to prove white supremacy and what they did to them. They measured the women's body parts and the men's body parts and all of these heinous things. And so I'm like, oh. And so then the next attachment I opened was renting. And I will take to my grave that experience, because as soon as I opened that attachment and Rinty looked me in the eye, I knew in that moment that this was the man that I had heard so many stories about for my entire life. And I was just stuck in that moment. We were just staring at each other. And I remember calling my girls to say, come look at this, you gotta come see this. And they came to the computer and I said, this is paparinti. And we all immediately knew this was the paparinti that my mother had talked about for all the years. And we were so excited. It was kind of like finding an old phone and turning it on and finding old pictures that you hadn't seen in years. It was just like this real exciting moment. And, we're talking about family resemblances and what we saw in him. And then all of a sudden it hits me about Harvard's race. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. You know, this can't be, you know, my Papa Rinty. My Papa Rinty was an educator. He was all these things, and this is a lie, Harvard. You got to correct this. And so I remember being just like so emotionally excited, and then like hitting a brick wall and crashing and thinking about him being used and exploited in that way. And I didn't include in this presentation any of the images because they are graphic, and that is another conversation to have at a certain point to talk about viewing images of exploited people, and is there a greater good or is it a continuation of the harm? And in this case, I personally believe that we have to see the harm that was inflicted during slavery, because if we don't know the extent of the harm, we will never firstly be able to heal from it and understand the pain that was associated with it. But Rich did an amazing thing, and I talk about the proof in the lineage. There's 5 generations of men in my family named Rinty. There was the man in the daguerreotypes. He named his son Rinty. That man Rinty named his son Rinty, who named his son Rinty, which was my great-great-grandfather. My uncle was named Rinty, my mother's brother, and my mother's father's brother. There were 5 men in my direct lineage that were named after this man, and there were other children of his who then named their children Rinty. That is what that man meant to his family, and that's something that Harvard doesn't understand. And so the next line. One of the things that, this is a death record, and this is Arthurtown, and this is the deed. So one of the amazing, when I talk about the amazing things that happened, I'm researching and looking for, I had at this point the slaveholders, not only probate will, but also his slave index, and I had the names of the slaves. And when you're doing the genealogical research, it's not for the faint of heart, because you really have to prepare yourself and kind of gird yourself, because going through these slave indexes and you're in with your family and you're going down the line of your family members, you're gonna encounter a pig, a cow, and other animals, and then back. And so it's just like, I remember doing the research one night, and I'm looking at that, and I just had to pause and say, the inhumanity of man at that time to not see a black man or a black woman as any more than a cow or a pig and group them all together as a pet or an animal. So doing the research, like I said, it's not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of ups and downs and disappointments and just trauma and going through the paperwork. But the reason why I share this, and I'll explain a little more later, but Arthurtown is a community that was established by Rinty's descendants that migrated away from the Thomas Taylor plantation and brought land from him and established Arthurtown. And this happens to be some of my family. And this piece of information, and I explain it a little later, it just explains, because again, all while I'm on this journey, Harvard is saying to the press, she can never prove it, she can never link her Rinty to our Rinty, there's no way. And so, but like I said, I had favor and they didn't. Next slide, please. So, in my journey, I met this amazing person who, I happened to meet her on the internet. I was joining a lot of groups, and this was Lower County, South Carolina. And so I joined this group, and I met this amazing woman named Rose. And she ultimately helped me find a descendant of Benjamin Franklin Taylor, because I knew in the probate records that my family was dispersed amongst Benjamin Franklin Taylor's children. They went to Mississippi, Alabama, from Columbia to Charleston to Georgia. So my family was dispersed, and in order to piece it back together, I had to find where Benjamin Franklin Taylor's children went so that I could find where my family went. And so Rose helps me find Dr. Edmund Taylor, and I could explain to you, Rose actually found the telephone number, And she called me and she gave it to me. And I'm like, are you going to call? She said, I'm not calling him, you call him. And so I just jumped on the phone and started dialing. And then without thinking, like, what are you going to say? So I'm calling this man who is a descendant. He's actually the great-great-grandson of Benjamin Franklin Taylor. He's a doctor who lived, he passed during COVID. He was 98 years old. And so I call his home, and I actually get his daughter on the phone. It was very pleasant. And, you know, I'm thinking, they're going to think I'm crazy because I don't know what to say, but when she answers the phone, I said, I'm doing a genealogical project, and I'm trying to find my family who was enslaved by Benjamin Franklin Taylor, and that they were dispersed among the children, and I need to find someone who knows the Taylor family history so that I could, you know, piece together my family. And she said, you'd want to talk to my father, but he's 98 years old and hard of hearing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, on another dead end. But it turns out, you know, she said, tell me what you want him to know, and I'll tell it to him. So I would say something, she'd scream to him, he'd scream back, and then she would tell me. But the long and short of it is he invited me to come and spend a weekend with him in Columbia, South Carolina. So I hang up the phone and I go to my girls, we're going to South Carolina, and they're like, Mom, you're crazy, no way, I'm not going. And so I could not get them to go with me, but I did meet with Rose, and I did travel to South Carolina. And so this is a video, I'm not gonna play for you, it's kind of long, but Dr. Taylor was, the first thing he said to me is he wanted me to know that the Taylors treated their slaves with dignity and respect, that they were good slaveholders. And so, and I will never be rude to anybody. I was trying to be polite. And I was grateful for the opportunity to learn more about the family so that I can do my work. But I had to point out that dignity and slavery should never be in the same sentence. But what was amazing about our visit, I learned a lot. The one thing that I knew in the probate will was that my ancestor was the family carpenter. So we're sitting at the table that he had prepared for us, and he had set it up real pretty because he wanted to show me how benevolent their family was and what they had given and what they had given back. They invited people who he had put through college to be at lunch with us, and took us around and showed us all the land that they had donated and given away, just, you know, how benevolent he was and that they were good slaveholders and good people. But one thing he said was, you're sitting at a table and chair that was hand-carved by the Taylor family carpenter, and you're eating it from dishes that belonged to Benjamin Franklin Taylor. And so I was stuck in that moment again because I knew in the will that my enslaved ancestor was the carpenter. So he's talking, and I'm stuck on my ancestor carved these tables and chairs. And and the pictures don't do it justice, but the detail and the woodwork and the mastery of the woodwork was just amazing. And I was just marveling in that moment. And I remember thinking, do they understand the value to me of these tables and chairs and what that would mean to me? And what are they going to do with it? And so I'm thinking about these things, and he's still talking. I don't even know what he's saying. But he was very, very, you know, like I said, he set up an event for me to come into Columbia, South Carolina, and see how benevolent the Taylors were. And one thing that I had to point out to him, because he said again that they were good slaveholders, and you know they traveled the South establishing Christian churches and indoctrinating their enslaved people. And so one of the things that I said was, do you think maybe your ancestors were duped? You have all of these politicians coming from the North to the South, and then going back and saying, we'll never speak against slavery again because you're such good slaveholders. Maybe they had an ulterior motive, and that was to promote slavery. And he was like, no. But he didn't get it, but I did. But nonetheless, it was an amazing visit, and I learned a lot. And these pictures, I visited the slave burial ground where my ancestors were buried. Another experience not for the faint of heart, because what you will see is lives thrown away. Most enslaved burial grounds now have fallen in such disrepair you wouldn't even recognize it was a place of you know, this is sacred space, or it should be. And you go there and you just see disrepair and chaos. And one thing that did stand out, and the person who was with us, he explained these yucca plants that we saw, what was usually left as headstones and markers for the enslaved people. And and we just saw them scattered all over the place. And I remember thinking, these people built the South. They lived and died. They toiled their entire life. And there's not even a marker to show they ever existed. Not a birth record, a death record, or even a headstone. And it was just a sad experience. Next. So I'm moving along in my journey, building my documents and my research, and Harvard is still saying you'll never prove it. And they're also saying now, because at this point my story is starting to get out, that there's this woman who claims to be the great-great-great-granddaughter of this man in this iconic image. And Harvard is still denying it. But they're saying, you know, we're wrestling and we're grappling with our history of slavery. And they're talking about, publicly, they're talking about exploring and dealing with their ties to slavery, but privately, what they're doing is denying my ancestors not only their humanity and their dignity, but their oral history and their identity. Next. The other thing that Harvard was doing, they were exercising absolute, complete dominion and control over these daguerreotypes. Anybody who wanted to visit them, to see them, had to sign their life away copyright agreements. And if you dared to breach it, they were quick to sue you. And I'm just going to play this video, I think.
All of the photographs for the Getty series are appropriated images from other historical sources. Harvard threatened to sue me for the use of the first photograph that I showed you. So I thought, Harvard is going to sue me for using these images of black people in their collection. The richest university in the world. I think that I don't have really a legal case, but maybe I have a moral case that could be made that might be really useful to carry out in public. And so after worrying about it and thinking about it, I called them up and I said, I think actually your suing me would be a really good thing. You should. And we should have this conversation in court. I think it would be really instructive for any number of reasons, and certainly for artists that are really engaged in the act of appropriation, who think that there's a larger story to tell.
Okay, so that was artist Carrie Mae Weems. And what happened is she visited the Peabody Museum one afternoon and she saw the daguerreotypes. Now, mind you, these images are so graphic and so painful, they actually have tissue boxes there for people who cry when they see these images. And so what she secretly did after she signed all of these agreements and all of these things that are invalid because Harvard doesn't have copyright because these daguerreotypes are 170 years old and copyright expires after, 100 years or something? But at any rate, they didn't have a right to make you do those things. She goes back to New York and she puts together an exhibit entitled, "From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried." And so Harvard says, we're going to sue you because you took pictures and you had an exhibit of our images. And so when she challenged them, sue me, then Harvard had to put up or shut up. They knew that they didn't have a lawful right to sue her. They brought her images and then took control of them that way because they now owned them. And it actually really set her career on fire, and she became more and more popular because she challenged Harvard and conceivably won. Next. So at this point, I knew she really inspired me to look at this differently, and I'm thinking, you know what, maybe I need to talk with an attorney. And so early on, I'm saying, hey, you know, I'm having these issues with Harvard, and they're like, oh, you know, nobody wants to fight with Harvard, you know, I don't know what to tell you. And I'm talking to different people, and they're like, oh, you know, we're not going to take on Harvard, and you're crazy. And so I happened to be at a criminal justice workshop where Ben Crump was the keynote. And after he got through speaking, he was mobbed with people who wanted a selfie of him. And so I saw that as my opportunity to get in and get a selfie and then tell him about this case and see if I could convince him to help me. And so when I get my opportunity, we're fumbling with the camera and I'm talking as fast as I can about Harvard and what they're doing, and my enslaved ancestors have a right to this property and they're the victims of sexual exploitation and cultural appropriation, and it's a reparations case, it's a repatch, and I'm just talking as fast as I can. And so he says, you know, this is really interesting. And I thought he was just being pleasant. We exchanged contact information, and a couple of weeks later, he calls me and he says, Miss Lanier, he said, this is really a landmark case. He said, we need to meet and talk about it. And so we do. And he said, now I have to go back and sell this to my partners. Many of them who are white may not understand this. So I said, okay, we're screwed again. And so he calls me back later and he says, you know, my partners love the idea. He says, now I need a Connecticut attorney. And so then I knew we were in trouble because, again, Harvard's influence up and down the eastern, all over the country, but particularly in the Northeast. There's a Harvard alum on every board of everything, and they just literally control everything. So who is going to, from Connecticut, stand up against Harvard? So Ben happened to be on the set of the film Marshall. He had a cameo role. And the attorney, Michael Koskoff, is the man who wrote the film, Marshall. And he's from Connecticut. He's from Bridgeport, Connecticut. So Ben is on the set. These two meet in Hollywood in the filming of this movie, Marshall. And Ben convinces Mike to come on board. And after that, it's like, I call it the making of a dream team, because I don't know if you're following, but Koskoff, Ben is big. And in other arenas, I mean, the Koskoff firm, they're doing the Sandy Hook case. They just finished suing Alex Jones. They did Remington. Giants. And so, you know, when I look back and, you know, I talk about God's favor, because humble old me with nothing, I have two of the most prominent and powerful attorneys in the world who are fighting for me. And let me tell you one other thing. Neither one of them has ever asked me for a penny. All the work that they've been doing for years on this case, they've never asked me for anything. So I talk about the favor in my life. So my attorneys get together and they file the complaint in March of 2019, and it made headlines. It was on the front page of the New York Times. We have editorial cartoons that were created about the complaint. And what it did, and I think what I'll do is I'll go to the next slide that explains it a little more. Harvard, when the New York Times did their news story, they interviewed Harvard for the first time. Now, they wouldn't comment other than she can never prove it. So in the New York Times article, what they try to do is to dispel the possibility that my Rinty is the Rinty and the daguerreotype. And so what Harvard also did was they hired historians from all over the world to do the research to come up with an alternative narrative of my story. And I talk about the favor again, and how I find out that this is going on. The first time I found out, I happened to go to a lecture that was at UConn Law, where I meet with this woman, and she is the presenter, and she's talking about the fact that Harvard had just commissioned her and other historians to do this work, to find the descendants of the enslaved people in the daguerreotypes. And I stand up, and my daughter had just made me a big T-shirt with Rinty's image on it, because by now I'm putting Rinty on everything, even though Harvard told me I couldn't. I'm like, sue me. And so I said, well, Rinty is my great-great-great-grandfather. And she said, I've been working on this for years now, and Harvard has never said that they knew about a descendant of some of these enslaved people. So they have historians from all over the world doing this research, but never told them there was one woman who had come forward who said, with all of these records about who they are. And she said, Harvard never shared this. And then I got another email from someone who worked at the Harvard Press, who happened to be a friend of the woman who discovered the daguerreotypes. And he says to me, Harvard just sent me a bunch of scholarly articles and periodicals about the daguerreotypes, and they're publishing a book, but they don't even mention your story. And I said, well, they're just unethical. and so I said, I'm not surprised, but they're trying to create and control the narrative. And so one of the things, if we go back to that, I just want to point out what one of the people who Harvard had hired was talking about this slide here, and if you look up at the top, you see Big Rinty, Eve, and Creasy. He said that that's the man, and no, he said that this was a separate grouping, a separate family grouping, not related to this one here where you see Rinty, Eddie, Hector, Molly, Caesar, Delia, and July. He said they're two separate independent families not related. This is what Harvard is saying. They're supposed to be smart, right? So what I did, because by now I had memorized the entire slave index and the probate will, I shared this with the New York Times reporter, where this is Benjamin Franklin Taylor, the slaveholder's own handwriting, where he says, July, the brother of Eve. He's talking about, he's bequeathing these people to his daughter Annie, and he links July and Eve as brother and sister. And I showed the reporter, I said, July is here. Eve is here under Big Rinty, and here's July. And I said, slaveholder himself links the two families as brother and sister. And so I said, again, Harvard is trying to apply some modern day standards of family units to slavery, and it didn't exist. The slave families, the enslaved families didn't have the luxury of being a family or nuclear family unit as we understand it today. And I'm like, how dare Harvard do that? How dare they make sense? But they did. And I was like, they're supposed to be smart. Next slide. So we filed, and so now we're talking about it in the press, and more people are learning about it. And I want to share you this clip with Attorney Ben Crump and Attorney Kenya Barris talking about the case.
The thing that makes your case against Harvard, I want to get into it quickly, but the thing that makes your case, I want people to understand, so important, is that it stands to be the first prosecutable case against an industry, a foundation, which which is Harvard, that they said that these pictures that were taken against a person who had no rights, these pictures that were used to make millions upon tens of millions of dollars, were not that person's property. These pictures where he was stripped down and taken of his clothes, and the family says, all they asked Harvard to say, I don't want the money, I just want the pictures back. Harvard said no. Harvard said no. And when they said no, what they did unknowingly was set about, and this is why your case is so important, the case that sets the standard for what could become our argument for reparations, because there's no denying that what happened was beyond every law possible. And them refusing to give those pictures back, they had no rights. They had no right to take the pictures but they felt like the person had no rights. And so they're still saying the person had no rights. And your winning of this case sets the platform for what could be a multi-trillion-dollar argument for our people.
Absolutely. And to try to frame it just very simply, this picture, literally, these slave pictures are believed to be some of the earliest photographs taken in America, and certainly they believe the earliest photographs of African slaves ever taken. They call them daguerreotypes, and that was the first time they were having photographs. So Harvard has possession of them. Miss Lanier traced her roots, and they can prove that Papa Rinty is their grandfather through all these probate files and all this family history. And all they're saying, Kenya, is exactly what the Jews said after the Holocaust. You all were able to recover everything that was rightfully yours after this immoral, this unethical dynamic called the Holocaust. Why can't Black people recover our rights? And if the courts allow this landmark decision to go through, which we believe it's going to be, because we're on the right side of history, Kenya Barris, right, and we know this. And once we have that precedence, they teach us in first year law school, precedence is the key. Once you have precedence, we want the laws to be consistent. And therefore, the fact that we know Harvard is going to be embarrassed over and over again as they try to defend the indefensible, because their professor was trying to prove the inferiority of Black people when he stripped Rinty down naked, because he was a pure African. He didn't have any white in them. And he wanted to show that we were more prone to agrarian work, and we were more prone to be in the fields and so forth. So he stripped his daughter Delia down, and you see a tear in her eye when she's naked being made to stand in front of these white men while they take pictures of her to prove her inferiority as a human being. But yet these photographs are their family photographs. And Harvard is saying, no, you don't have a right to these pictures. So 150 years later, they're saying Renty still isn't free. Renty still is a slave. So we're going to get Harvard to give these pictures back, and that is going to lay the first case for reparations in America, because it will be the first time that descendants of slaves have ever recovered anything from an American institution
Listen to
based
that.
on slavery.
Say that again. Say that again.
It would be the first time that descendants of slaves have ever received any form of reparation of any kind from an American institution.
That is profound. Now, we could talk about this for hours.
So think about, again, the impossibility of our story. Firstly, I have researched, the attorneys have researched, we have not found one successful reparations case in the history of this country. They, for the most part, have been dismissed from the door for lack of standing, meaning you can't show a kinship or a relationship or a nexus between you and the enslaved person who you are bringing the action on behalf of. You have to be a descendant, a relative, or have some relationship to that person that's established in order to get standing to bring the case. And so we bridged that obstacle. We were able to show, and when I say we were able to show, it isn't here, but the first person who said that Tammy is who she says she is, that she's Renty's great, is the same person who did President Barack Obama's genealogy. He happened to be a friend of my daughter's who did some of the research as a favor to my daughter's friend. The final person who certified, who went on record as certifying that I'm Renty's granddaughter, is the woman who did Michelle Obama's genealogy. And she also is the person who does the research for Henry Gates' show, Who Do You Think You Are? So Harvard at this point can attack the credibility of the people saying that I am Renty's daughter, because they're Harvard's people. And they are coming forward to say, yes, it all lines up. She is a descendant. And so we're able to get beyond that hurdle of standing. Now, the next thing, when we're talking about property rights and property interests, we all know because of the laws of the 1800s that enslaved people weren't allowed to own property. They had no property. They had no property of value. So here is Renty and Delia with a property interest in something that's so valuable, it's priceless. So the likelihood of this happening, firstly, of it happening in general, is next to impossible because of the age-old laws that have been designed to oppress black people. The laws haven't evolved with society. They're still in the books. So the likelihood of being able to bring a successful reparations case because of the ways the laws are written is impossible. But here's someone who beat the odds and has standing and has an ancestor who has a property interest of something of value. So people refer to this case as dangerous because it's precedent setting. It's going to open a door that has been closed for the history of this country. The other thing that I ask people to consider, that as years go by, it becomes even more difficult to do this kind of research and to link yourself to someone back in the 1800s. So the likelihood of it happening again is very, very low. So this is a unique case that has kind of challenged the laws that have denied us access to justice and have disenfranchised us. And so now here we are standing on the shoulders of my enslaved ancestors petitioning for reparations, and they can't use the same barriers that they have in the past to throw the case out. So it's interesting. Next slide, please. this we'll show this one, and I'll explain a little bit after this, but one of the things that is important to understand about our case is not only the difficulty that we have as Afro-Americans in doing the genealogical research and researching our history and having access to records. We weren't documented. There were no records of our birth. There were no records of our death. There were no head markers. But beyond that, the few records that we did have were destroyed in the Civil War. So for many people doing the genealogical research, when you start getting towards the 1870s, you run into what the genealogical researchers call the brick wall. If you don't have an oral history or an elder who has told you where you go when you hit that brick wall, you might be stuck there and not able to move any further. And so, like I said, again, with the combination of not only access to information, but also someone who was the keeper of our family story and knew dates, places, and names, I was able to bridge all of that and definitively link me to my family. But this speaks to a little bit about the intention of slavery was to destroy the black family and to make us invisible. And this is a little clip that kind of develops that point.
Who's Johnny going to do it from your side? Johnny?
All right. Let's start from the bottom. This is me. This is my sister Megan. My mother. This is my grandmother. So this is the keeper of the story. This is the reason why we know Papa Renty. My grandmother used to tell stories all the time. So this is my grandmother, Maddie Pearl Thompson Lanier. Now, Frederick Douglass Thompson, we called him Fed. This is my grandmother's father. His father, Renty Taylor Thompson. His father, his father's daughter, Delia. And this is Papa Renty here. And this is the reason why we're here. We're asking that Harvard release these images. And then from this side, I'll turn over.
Yeah.
So,
can we talk about, just for a second, and talk about how challenging it is for African Americans to trace their roots, Tammy?
And I guess it's kind of an unspoken fact that the absence of these images says a lot, because we don't really have a heritage, because of the intention of slavery was to destroy the black family and to make us invisible. And these blank spaces here are from sharecroppers and former slaves who we don't have the luxury of having pictures and family photos of because of the circumstances of their servitude. So, this vacancy says a lot. It speaks to what the black culture endured.
And the only reason you have the two photos up here is because they were compelled for this racist study. So Tammy's answer, these would all be blank. And this is part of the problem. Look at the white side of the story.
This took about just minutes for my nephew to find photographs.
So we're going to go to the question and answer part of and I will try, there's so much more, but what I'll try to do is explain that a little more as we are discussing and answering your questions.
The owner of these images of Renty and Dahlia, but these images were seized violently. So beyond the justice that should be done to Tamara Lanier, there is an opportunity that these institutions will understand that they cannot continue to hold to what was plundered from others.
These are my ancestors. They're not photos, they're iconic people in our family. And so we are forcing Harvard to reckon with their dark past by surrendering these images that bring them a lot of prestige and repairing the harm that they've done to Renty and Delia. And that's reparations. That's justice. That's what it is. It's justice.
So we have to think about it as a visionary moment. Harvard could lead a transformative moment in the history of slavery. So really what Tamara Lanier is offering Harvard, this lawsuit, is a gift.
Okay, so the end. I think she has a mic.
Okay. We're going to use this for the audience. So if you have a question that you'd like to place to them, and I think Ms. Lanier is correct. She has so much more that she can share. Like I said, I heard at lunchtime some things that were like, what about Skip Gates and stuff like that. So I'll let you ask those questions. Any questions?
Actually have two questions. What's the status of the case now? And this Benjamin Franklin Taylor, did he ever ask you how you were feeling about what he said, we were good to our slaves?
Well, in terms of the descendant of Benjamin Franklin Taylor, no. I felt like he was trying to convince me that the slaveholders were good people who treated their slaves well, and everybody was one big happy family. And you know, I couldn't get him to see that I didn't think that my enslaved ancestors were happy. And certainly when you look at Rinty, he didn't look like he was a happy person. And so I think that was his way of dealing with the guilt. I know that his daughter, who has been asked to participate in documentaries of the story as well as to talk to the press, she has actually said, you know, she really doesn't want people to know that they descend from slaveholders. So they just have trouble reckoning with their past, I think. And so, but as for where the case stands, we did file. We filed in the Massachusetts lower court. And what happened was we argued that when Harvard commissioned the daguerreotypes, it was illegal to do. It was a crime. Massachusetts had abolished slavery. So these daguerreotypes are the plunders of slavery. They're the badges of slavery, plundered property, and that Rinty and Delia are crime victims entitled to restitution. Harvard argued that irregardless of how the photo is acquired, it belongs to the photographer and the subjects have no interest whatsoever. And that didn't make a lot of sense to us, but the court ruled in Harvard's favor. We appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and we had oral arguments on November 1st. And it is, I have a YouTube page and you can go and find some of the videos that we weren't able to show tonight, but it's amazing the line of questioning that the justices took with Harvard. Like, you know, the judges actually said, your argument is too narrow. What if a child pornographer takes pictures? Do they get to keep the pictures? What if someone is raped and do they get to keep the pictures of the rape? Ultimately, on June 23rd, actually, the court rendered a decision. It was, in my mind, a split decision. The first thing they said is that, Harvard, you have acted recklessly, negligently, outrageously, and yes, there was, in their 91-page decision, there was not one line that you can find favorable to Harvard. They talked about the fact that Harvard had a moral obligation to engage with me, and they didn't. And so the court ruled that Harvard needs to be sued for the emotional distress that they inflicted on Rinty and Delia and our family. And so they gave us, they opened, and we weren't asking for all of that because we were just give us the pictures. But they said, no, you go back and sue Harvard for the pain and the emotional distress that they inflicted on your enslaved ancestors and your family, which was a huge one for us.
Though was intentionally, though. So
Yes.
the court acknowledged that it was intentionally done,
Yes.
and that it continued progressively throughout the process over the years. And so they noted that as intentional infliction of emotional duress and negligently intentional on top of that. So,
which is historic, because now we have, and we just recently refiled the complaint, and it's in the Massachusetts Superior Court. But now on the docket, Harvard is going to have to compensate Rinty and Delia for their enslavement and us for the emotional distress. So I'm like, what does that look like? And it's historic because it has never happened before.
But they also made it clear that Harvard can't divorce itself from the things that they've done in the past. And that part of owning that is going to be in the reimbursement for that emotional distress, but that they can't separate themselves from that they had a key and pivotal role in the exploitation of our ancestors and the continued exploitation now.
I just wanted to follow up with one of the things that you said. First, thank you for your presentation and comments. It's really fascinating. You just said that Harvard would have to pay for their enslavement. Why would that be, since Harvard didn't enslave them?
Why? I didn't hear the last part of your question. Why?
I think you just said that Harvard would be liable to have to pay for the enslavement of Rinty and his daughter. Mm-hmm. Why would that be, since Harvard did not enslave them?
Well, Harvard is the emotional suffering of my enslaved ancestors. The case that the court opened the door for was for the infliction of emotional distress of my enslaved ancestors. And what the court also did was they reaffirmed the lower court's decision, leaving the pictures with Harvard. But what the court has ruled, and actually again, the decision is online and you can find it. They say that you caused emotional distress. You acted recklessly. You acted with malice. You acted outrageously. You acted, in terms of punitive damage, the language they used was extreme in terms of the court finding fault in what Harvard did. So not so much, and if I said that I may have misspoke, but they're not paying for their enslavement, but the pain and suffering they inflicted because of the taking of the daguerreotypes.
And their complicity in that, and the continued profit from
yes.
that.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but just an observation that I'd like to share. You're fortunate that you're able to go deep into this, and as you pointed out, it's an avenue that's not available probably to the majority of people. So it kind of speaks to reparations having to be a kind of collective process for all the descendants of those that were enslaved. But what you showed, you said this was 1850 when this research was done. And the depravity of the researchers, right, to talk about, the conditions of black, 45 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois gets a doctoral degree from that very same institution. So we're talking about, just the fight for our humanity, for our intelligence, all of those things are really on show here. And I think what you've done is very important in terms of bringing that out.
And the Northern complicity, this was a financial venture, a financial motive. The production of these daguerreotypes was done to promote the interest of the Northern businessmen who were heavily invested in cotton. And those were Harvard executives at the time. So this was all done for financial gain and financial motives. And historically we learn about slavery in the South, but the North gained just as much as the South did for slavery.
And Lewis, he had not seen a black person prior to coming to the United States. He had no experience. He was completely on the other side of zoology. There was no conversation about polygenicism at that point when he first came here. It was completely a money grab for Harvard. It was, they wanted to establish a new college. They needed a professor for that, but they also needed money for that. That endowment came from a rich textile owner who was able to link with Agizi, who had seen the first black person and was completely scared out of his mind at that point. It was grotesque. He had all types of narratives where he wrote a letter to his mother describing his first experience with a black person, where he said he couldn't get them away couldn't get away from them fast enough to say that he didn't want them serving his food. And so he, at that point, hooked up with this guy who wanted to look into polygenicism, who was collecting skulls. What do you have, like 600
Samuel
skulls?
Morton.
Yep, trying to collect up skulls and prove that black people came from another sect. And at that point, it was just advantageous. Harvard said, we like the sound of that. It helps us out. We got this textile guy who could make a lot of money if we keep slavery going. If not slavery, but the benefits of cheap black labor. And so you have the North making money. You have Harvard opening up their school, so they're in competition with Europe now. They're first and prestigious in the country with something now. And of course, you got to follow the money. It was all advantageous for Harvard to continue to promote this pseudoscience because it made money.
Can I follow up and ask a question? This is like an inside question. Can you say something about how Harvard's community reacted, and particularly first about the students and the way the students react?
Well, there's two separate responses from Harvard insiders: the students versus the faculty. The faculty was mute.
Never heard of that.
Those being paid by Harvard, they kept silent as Harvard wanted them to, but the students were amazing. They mobilized. The undergraduate student body voted to condemn Harvard for its treatment of our family and for its refusal to relinquish the daguerreotypes to us. The students wrote a legal brief on behalf of our lawsuit. And one student in particular, one Afro-American male who was, the justices all quoted his brief. He was powerful. And he wrote, his brief was entitled, "Harvard Archives Bear Strange Fruit. There's blood on the leaves and blood on the root." He talked about, he was an archivist. He was I think he's a PhD student now. But he firstly laid out all of his credentials, impeccable. And then he goes on to explain that in doing the research, what he was finding was that Harvard's archives were like a cesspool of inhumanity. They didn't have any of the documents that they should have to certify that they received these artifacts lawfully and properly. There's a concept in curation, it's called providence, that shows that you have good title, that you received an artifact and the person who gave it to you had a lawful right to gift it to you, and that you have a paper trail for the artifacts that you are curating. And he says he's not seeing anything. He said, unless it's hiding in plain sight, the paperwork that should be there simply is not there. So Harvard never even had good title to the daguerreotypes that they still get to keep according to the court. But the students were just amazing in terms of mobilizing, in terms of participating in the documentary. They formed a Harvard Coalition to Free Rinty, which was a culmination of all the student groups on campus. And they have, for if there's something going on at the university, like a conference or something, they're tagging me on social media. Are you aware they're having a conference about the daguerreotypes? So they were just informative. And the other thing that they were instrumental in revealing, because Harvard has many times throughout the year had this public campaign where they're saying they're grappling with their ties to slavery. They commission a group, they study their ties, they put together a report, and it's buried. And the students said, if you look at this, they showed me websites where in 2004, 2007, 2011, 2017, they had these same commissions to study their ties to slavery. And after the report was done, they quickly buried it. And so they've never been serious about looking at their ties to slavery and doing something restorative.
But they call themselves the ethical stewards of the image.
So, I want to, I believe somewhere in one of the clips, there was a statement by Ben Crump related to the fact that there has never been, that this would be precedent setting, this litigation, if it's succeeded. And I'm not aware, not that I've done any extensive research, in any litigation, reparations related, that has succeeded in a decision by a court to say you're entitled to reparations. Now, but the Japanese internment situation, of course, from World War II, there was a political decision by Congress to provide some reparations, but it was limited to, if my memory serves me correctly, the survivors, those who had lived through it. So if somebody had died, a living relative would not necessarily be entitled to anything. That's about, there might be a couple of other instances of reparations in this country, but that's about the only one I can really think of, and that wasn't litigation, that was a political decision to deal with that.
There is more. I think with the Japanese Americans, I think descendants got a lesser percentage of that $2,400 or something. But in 2016, in 2015, then President Obama passed legislation, and what I do now, when I see these websites, I print them, because they do pull these from the internet, and you go back and they're not there. But I printed, what they did was, and there's a story about an Austrian-born woman, her name is Maria Altman, and she discovered an image of her aunt that was being lauded in Austria as the Austrian Mona Lisa. It was a painting that belonged to her family. And so she wanted it back. This was something that happened in Austria, but she was able to sue here in American courts. But after her struggle, she ultimately was able to recover the property. After her struggle, Congress got together, and one of the senators who led this campaign was my senator, Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut. And they passed the HERE Act. It's the Holocaust Expropriated Art and Recovery Act. But what it says is museums, if you have plundered property from victims of the Holocaust, give it back. Do the research yourself and find who these people are and give it back to them. And not only that, but it also suspended statutes of limitations, and it did other amazing things that we've never heard of in law. And yes, but it was, they recognized the wrong, and they said, give it back. And so I point to the HERE Act that was passed, signed by President Obama. Joe Biden, there are, and I'm not being political, but I'm just speaking facts, because what I say is, I agree that the legislative enactments that Congress passed to repair the harm caused to the Japanese Americans, to the Native Americans, to the Jewish, it's a necessary measure. But I only question, where is that same humanity for the descendants of American chattel slavery? You don't even want to have the conversation, but you pass legislation to make other aggrieved groups whole. But you don't even want to raise the R word, as most people refer to it. And it's just simply racist. And it's a refusal to deny the descendants of American chattel slavery their due process and what should be afforded to them by the Constitution.
Because as long as we remain disinherited, then we have no real power.
Yeah. And so, reparations it's not as foreign as people would act like. We don't know what to do. We've done it many times in history before, but you just don't want to entertain it when it comes to the descendants of American chattel slavery. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk and for your work, for your courage. And just to your last statement, I love during the course of your research, and you talked about that this is about repair and healing, and reparations is just one part of repair. Just want to make that point. But my question is there any reason to believe that Harvard may have DNA evidence, from Brinty, and would that make a difference to your case?
Well, it would help my case if they did, but I don't believe they do. And I'll tell you, I showed that one picture of slave burial grounds. I found where Delia is buried. And I didn't go into, I showed George Thompson's death record. And my friend Rose, who I found on the internet, another gift from God, because I say that she's the only person in the world who could have looked at George's death certificate and made that realization. But what was so significant about George Thompson's death record, I knew he was an ancestor. Rinty and my great-great-great-grandmother Tina are listed there. But George lived and died in Arthurtown, and I showed that. Arthurtown was land that was owned by the slaveholders. So what that death record did was place my family on Benjamin Franklin Taylor's land. They're buried there. So Harvard was saying, my Rinty is not the same. My Rinty is buried, and I can prove my family is buried on the slaveholders' land, in the slave cemetery. But what's sad, and I think I mentioned it before, is when you go to these sacred spaces, and many of these enslaved people fought in the Civil War and Revolution. They're veterans, and you know you're supposed to honor these veterans with special markers and special acknowledgments, and they're thrown away. So Harvard doesn't know where Rinty is buried, and they don't have a way to access and get the DNA, but if they did, it would show that I'm his great-great-great-granddaughter. But the other thing that I think it's also important to keep in mind, Harvard, I have had I like to say that my mom left me a roadmap for me to start where I am and trace back. It's very difficult to start in the past and trace forward unless you have a roadmap. Harvard doesn't have it. And if they had only asked me, I could tell them, this is where you go. This is where my family is buried on the slaveholders' land. How much more do I need to prove? I have 5 generations of men in my direct line named after Rinty. And there's so much more. I can show where, based on the wills that my ancestors were gifted to his children. And Benjamin Franklin, my mom, born in a small community in Montgomery called Mount Meigs. Benjamin Franklin Taylor owned plantations in Mount Meigs. Mount Meigs was a very small community, and he filed a probate will in Mount Meigs. And so there's so much evidence to show that I am the man's, but they never asked because they wanted to have the deniability to say there's no way she can prove it.
I think, but it's also key that my grandmother used to tell us from when I didn't realize what it meant until we started doing this research, that we were Taylors before we were Thompsons. And so for me, I just figured that was just another name that you put on the checklist. Like it didn't make any sense until this story came about. And so when we started getting a dead end at Thompson, we knew to start looking for Taylors.
All these Taylors are popping up.
So once you start seeing Taylors, you had this understanding that we were Taylors before we were Thompsons. And that was the transition there. So we knew to start looking for the next. She also referred to Papa Rinty as the Black African. And again, like I'm 6 years old, listen to these stories, I'm figuring every Black person is also African, every African is also Black. My mind didn't process it until we figured out that he was actually embezzled into the country after the slave embargo, that he was truly an African and known as the Black African because he had been brought in later on and was selected specifically for this research because he
one of the very few African-born men at that time. So the little pieces, the little nuggets that my mom was giving us is exactly what we needed to pinpoint our genealogy to Rinty.
Furthermore, she told us that he had taught himself to read and that he had used Noah Webster's blueback speller at the time. And so what we also found was that Noah Webster was known to frequent and was close with B.F. Taylor. And that at that time he was circulating his new speller where they were teaching young white children in the South how to read and write using that. So there are just these little things that she would tell us all the time that we didn't understand the importance of how that would help us in this journey and wouldn't have been able to get to where we were had we not known that information.
And also keep in mind, because we're taught that many of the slaves were illiterate, but slaves secretly learned to read and write. They couldn't broadcast that because they could be killed. But after doing this research, I'm of the opinion that there were more literate, educated slaves who just did not talk about it than we were led to believe.
I want to take already being explored, which is that if you win your suit, that because the images were used to perpetuate slavery in general, will that open up the possibility of reparations for other descendants of enslaved people in general? Because that would be a really amazing achievement if other people can kind of piggyback onto this decision if it becomes available.
I think Attorney Crump spoke to that in the video that we watched a little earlier about how it would set a precedent that other people could use to establish cases. But I think that in general, it's going to be a fight either way for us or for anyone else. But anything that we do now, we do it with the hope that it would be spread to everyone.
Yeah, and I think what's happening, like Attorney Crump has been contacted and now is representing Henrietta Lack's family. He was a part of the case involving the beachfront property. We, as descendants of slaves, had property. We had intellectual property. I've heard from Jack Daniels' family, Aunt Jemima's family. What has happened, and I was sharing this with Dr. Jordan earlier, years ago when I was a kid in school, our Black History was a Black History Week. But what we were taught was how property was plundered, or intellectual property or advances was stolen from Black people who had invented this, who had discovered this, and others had come along and taken credit for it. But that's plundered property. And so now what we have, because of the access to information, if we have descendants who are doing the work and can link themselves to something where they can show their property was plundered, they could sue in court. And so Kenya Barris kind of talked about the transference of wealth. When you look at like Henrietta Lacks and what that transference of wealth would mean for her family, what it meant for the family, the beachfront. But if we start to do the research and discover these links or the nexus between our family's plundered property, their farms, their intellectual property, their recipes, KFC or whatever, and show how they were victimized, they could seek redress in court. So it's a form of reparations, but I'm not saying that this is the only approach to reparations, because I still say the precedent is what we've done in the past. And in the past, you started with a paycheck. And so I said a very minimum, this is just my opinion, you start with you be consistent with what you've done in the past. But again, in terms of 400 years of slavery and all that followed, the reparations discussion is much larger than a paycheck. It's much larger than returning plundered property. It's about policy changes, the evolution of the criminal justice system. So but we can't just keep burying our heads in the sand and saying, no, we're not gonna have the discussion, because we will never heal and there will never be the reconciliation until there's some real genuine discussion about repairing the harm caused by slavery.
There's two other things that we wanted to very briefly before we formally end. First, to thank you again and sort of express our appreciation for participating in this conversation. I do also want to thank the staff of the Stone Center who did all of the work so that I can come up with. But I want to point to a couple of things that we spoke about at lunch, and that was to talk about the example of Brown University and some of the other universities that took the lead in acknowledging and even daring to ask the questions and make the admissions that were necessary to start what we see now as a little bit more of a broader movement. Sitting in the audience with us is Pat Parker, who's co-chair of the university's History, Race, and the Way Forward Committee, Commission. Also director of the Institute of Arts and Humanities, and the commission is working with the university to plan a conference. The other point that I want folks to really take back with you is what Ms. Lanier said about students and the role that students have played across the country at making, forcing, encouraging, and demanding that their institutions come to terms with their histories of repression, participation in it directly, indirectly, and otherwise, and why that's an important and instructive lesson for us, even here at UNC at Chapel Hill, where students take a leading role in making this community understand what its history is. I wanted to stop at this point because I know some of you want to thank Ms. Lanier and Shani personally for having taken this step outward. I'm quite sure that when Ms. Lanier retired, she never felt she would be getting back into an entirely new line of work. But it is a very, very important task that you've taken on. We're very happy that you did it. Please help me in thanking her for coming here